Everyone, thank you for joining today's KINETIC-CON Fireside Chat. We have a very special program for you today, and we are extremely excited to introduce today's Fireside Chat guest, Phillip Gaskin. I'm going to tell you all a little bit about Phillip, and then we will jump right into the program. Before we get started, I just want to let you all know, feel free to use the chat, share any questions that you all may have, and I'll make sure to try to answer them before we wrap up today's session, or let Phillip answer them before we wrap up today's session. So very excited, drop your questions, and let's go ahead and get started. So first, I would love to introduce Phillip. Phillip Gaskin is the Vice President of Entrepreneurship of the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, where he's responsible for leading the foundation's comprehensive entrepreneurship portfolio. This includes grant making, operating programs, convening research, and policy. Phillip is charged with leading a team of more than 30 associates and providing vision, strategic thinking, and thought leadership to scale and deepen the impact of the foundation's entrepreneurship strategy. Prior to joining the foundation, Phillip was Chief Operating Officer for Impact Hub, which supports impact-driven entrepreneurial action. He also served as a political strategist and campaign director for national candidates. He has extensive experience in the private sector and was vice president at BCD Group, a leading global firm in the travel industry. He's a native of Los Angeles. Let us know if we have any people from LA here with us today. And he has ties to Kansas City and Philadelphia. He attended Pennsylvania State University and graduated with a marketing degree from California State University. Phillip is a national leader in the entrepreneurship ecosystem. He's driven to build opportunities for all and is a champion of inclusive entrepreneurship. We can't think of a more well-versed and experienced voice in this space, and we are thrilled to have you join us today, Phillip, for this Fireside Chat. First, thank you, of course. Yes, thank you for your overflowing KINETIC-CON support. And then for everyone who's new joining us this year, Phillip joined us last year, and so he's just really a champion. And we can't wait to hear your insights today. Yes.
Wonderful to be here. And Quinn, love the story too. Thank you. I love hearing those stories. Glad we were able to help. And hello, everyone out there. Just happy to be here. Look forward to what we're about to get into.
Perfect. Yes, can't reiterate enough. Without you all's support of the foundations, we wouldn't even be able to offer this session today. So let's get started.
All right.
So first, let's hear a little bit about your motivations into jumping into the entrepreneurship space. What inspired you to get involved as a champion for entrepreneurship? And what excites you most about having this tremendous platform to promote and foster entrepreneurship?
Well, I think thanks for that. When I look at every community across the United States, there are people who deserve that chance to be supported, to be celebrated, to be heard, have their ideas heard. And we call those the dreamers or the builders or the risk takers or the problem solvers. And the very best of these people have a special name, right? And that's entrepreneurs. That's what we call them. Fearless, determined people. And, it's said that entrepreneurs are the people who do more than anyone thinks is possible with less than anyone thinks is possible. And that's what drives them. They have it within themselves to create and scale solutions. But what drives me a lot is that just too many of them not getting into the game or falling out of the game because of all the different barriers that get in the way. And so I wake up every morning with knowing that there's work to be done. There's people out there with great dreams and great ideas. And as I say, they're sort of the last great untapped asset class that's just hiding out there that we can't see, that need an opportunity. So that's what that drives me every single day. Pop out of bed.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that. We'd also love to hear, if you're willing to share a little bit more about your legacy of entrepreneurship and in your father's history and how it's inspired you to stay motivated and push in this space every day.
Yeah, and I thought about that when you asked me about what drives me. So I look back and this really raised up for me in the last couple of years, the time, during COVID, when you sit back and you do a lot of reflecting. But so my dad was a very dark-skinned Black man, and he spent years working maintenance at offices and stores and things. And we lived in a neighborhood that was about a block away from another neighborhood, divided by one street, a long street that goes through Los Angeles. And depending on which side of the street you lived on, what side of that block you lived on, you had a completely different experience. If you lived on the north side, that's where children of different of parents that were either more affluent or what have you were, and they knew what entrepreneurship was. We lived on the other side, and I remember at school, I didn't know what entrepreneurship was. I didn't know my dad knew the word because the language was missing. And I tell the story that I was 34 years old when I first heard the word entrepreneurship. And it was at a memorial for my dad at the funeral. And a man came up to me and he said, your dad was a really good man. And he was a really good entrepreneur. And I looked at him like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so if you look at why it took that long, language, opportunity, understanding what building wealth is all about, those things that are missing for too many students today, right? And so as I mentioned, he was a dark-skinned man, spent years working maintenance. And so we had a ritual. So around in the 5th grade, he picked me up from school about 3 to 4 times a month. Before going home, we'd go to a bank, and we kept going to banks. And finally one day I said to him, why are we going to so many banks? He said, I'll tell you when you get older. Well, it turns out he was trying to get that first loan to open a chain of convenience stores. And it's when you look at what investors talk about, they always talk about at every initial public offering, what's the barriers to entry? Well, my dad's barrier to entry with these banks was that he lived 1 block away from what they considered worthy. He didn't know about redlining. And that's what was happening, where banks literally drew lines down the streets of where they would lend to and where they wouldn't. And that's still going on today, obviously, right? And that went on for 4 years of just going to banks and going to banks. And so finally, after hearing no dozens of times, he finally heard yes. There's a Black-owned bank, Broadway Federal Savings in Los Angeles, that finally gave him a loan. And I remember that day. I do remember that day, and how elated he was. And he said, someone finally trusted me. And he went back and got a second loan after opening up the first store, South Central LA, just south of the LA Coliseum. And when I think back, the investments that the bank made paid off, because he wasn't just a good entrepreneur, he was a good asset for the community, because for 20 years he created jobs and gave back to the community. And so what hurts me is that he never went beyond those 2 stores, because I do also remember him saying, I don't ever want to be told I'm not worthy ever again. Because of going back and hearing you're 1 block away, or your credit score is 7 points too low, or whatever the reasons, all because he lived 1 block away. Those things are going on still today. They're going on in rural America, they're going on urban edge, they're going on in suburban, they're urban. These still type of barriers and constructs are still going on. So it goes back to the first question about what gets me out of bed in the morning. It's living for my dad and making sure that folks don't have to go through what he went through.
Well, a powerful story. Thank you so much for your openness and willingness to share that ever-present example that is still facing many of us today, as we kind of are struggling to go to banks and get that funding and are looking for funding sources to really believe in our viable businesses. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And hopefully this has us all thinking hard about how we can still continue to fight the systemic changes or fight for those systemic changes that are still needed today. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Of course. Next, we would love to transition a little bit and
Okay.
hear more about the Kauffman Foundation and your work there and your impact on the entrepreneurship ecosystem. Would you mind sharing the Kauffman Foundation's goals and desired outcomes for entrepreneurship, and what strategies are you all using to build more inclusive entrepreneurship ecosystems?
Sure. Well, first, Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. So we're a private, nonpartisan foundation. We're based here in Kansas City, Missouri. And we believe that all people, regardless of their race, gender, or geography, should have the same opportunity to achieve economic stability, mobility, and prosperity. And so the work first is grounded in the principles of racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. That's consistent with Mr. Kauffman and his principles. So what we're seeking is to build inclusive prosperity through a prepared workforce and entrepreneurship-focused economic development. And how do we do that? By changing conditions, addressing root causes, not just the symptoms, but to break down those barriers and the inequities that we talked about. And so when we look at the entrepreneurship strategy, as I said, no matter what part of the country you're in, entrepreneurship isn't just an art, but it's a science. It's one of those sciences that can be ignited and taught and supported. And so what we look to do is, as I say, change those conditions by changing the systems in which people operate. Got to identify the barriers, look at the causes, the root causes, and not just treat the symptoms. And we do that through a range of different programs in our work. So obviously, as our research work, research informs everything that we do. So our research work informs our policy work. Policy informs our programmatic work, which is entrepreneur learning and capital access, and our ecosystems work, and then our heartland-based strategy that looks at strengthening the heartland around us, because we sit right in the middle of 4 states, Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. And so we test a lot of things right here. But so it's really a systems change-based strategy that looks at how do we get more entrepreneur-focused policies, programs, and practices into as many communities or adopted by as many institutions as possible in order to make change that spurs economic development.
Powerful. And we're going to dive in a little bit more on that research piece later, and love that all of your work is evidence-based and the expansive amount of research you all are doing and how you fund research to feed into this so that, as mentioned, you can make real root systemic changes. So thank you for walking us through that and how you all are making a difference in your strategies. And I'm sure people listening in today who are trying to look at making changes will be inspired by that. Thank you. Would love to hear a little bit more. So something we saw that we were really inspired by was your president and CEO of the Kauffman Foundation, Wendy Gillis, said, enabling more people to do better does not mean that others must do worse.
Right.
Extremely powerful statement. And when we think about the changing US demographics and systemic challenges that we discussed earlier for those who've been historically disadvantaged. Despite these challenges, your foundation continues to push for opportunities for entrepreneurs of color and women. Can you talk about how you all are prioritizing these groups and how you're kind of focusing to make sure that you're making a more equitable playing field in the world of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, thanks for that. What Wendy is talking about, it's not a zero-sum game. This is not, we're sort of programmed that way, I think, in the States, in the United States, to think through, okay, so you got to take from over here and put it over there to be better. Well, it can't be about taking, it doesn't work, especially in economic development. It doesn't work. And so what Wendy believes in is empowering us to do our best work for the mission, right? And as I mentioned, that focus on building the economic stability, mobility, and prosperity. So I get to lead a team that works on the priorities. And so we pilot the new ideas, we help support and build capacity And her leadership gives us the clear vision, but it also gives us her styles to give us the freedom to choose the resources that we need and to bring our own experience to the table to show up and get the work done. And how we prioritize it. So again, it's listening. Go back to my community organizer days. We always said that you have to listen 70% of the time and talk 30% of the time. If you're out of that ratio, you're not learning enough about what the community needs or that volunteer needs or that voter needs or anything like that. And at the same time, it's listening to the communities and the communities as it relates to capital access, as it relates to race, equity, diversity, inclusion in entrepreneurial communities, as it relates to policy, all of those different things. And then and then we'll get into research later, but then using research to help inform as well and contribute to that listening. And then the priorities come out of that. But, and that's how we got to our top two driving priorities of prepared workforce and entrepreneur-focused economic development. What we were hearing was that unless the workforce is more prepared, then no matter how many businesses are started, you're not going to have people coming to either start those businesses or be employed in them, because of the pathways that need to be built through education, through real world learning experiences, to then have a workforce prepared to then, hey, I want to go out and start my own thing, or I want to be an employee. How do I have the pathway to those companies that are either established or businesses have been started? So it's really looking at that. We prioritize looking through the lens of the whole arc of the child and the student through K-12, and then through adult learning, and then into entrepreneurship, and making sure that the pathways are there. Because you could argue that what does the high school diploma mean right now? Right. For too many people, it's not a pathway over, it's a stopping point. Not everyone wants to go to college, can go to college, is excited about college or the next step, but they got a really, really great idea. How do we make that pathway to make that idea a reality? So I went in a number of different directions there, as I will do every now and then, but hopefully that helped.
No, that was great. I could probably pick your brain on that all day. I love what you said about pathways and connecting that back to your story of when you even heard about entrepreneurship. Oh, yeah. There are some schools that are teaching it and some are not.
And I look back and I just go, what could my dad have been had he had the language? Right. What could I have been or done differently? I'm loving what I'm doing now. I mean, my sister says, that's perfect. What you're doing is made for you. Right. Don't ever change. Yeah.
Yes. And we are so glad that you are walking in that purpose and that purpose is benefiting so many of us today. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that and how you all are doing that work. Would love to dive a little bit more into funding. A lot of people are here today because they want to hear, about the funding space. Some are entrepreneurs and they want to actually get some funding and figure out the best pathways to do that. Others may be investors to figure out how to invest in diverse businesses. And others are just part of the community who want to support. They want to support their friends and family, support their local economics. And we understand, and the research shows us that independent and small businesses can do that. So we'd love to dive a little bit deeper into the funding piece, as has really just been a theme throughout our conversation already today.
Yeah, sure. Well, we look back at research again, and we'll get into that. But in 2019, we did an access to capital for entrepreneurs, big research report. And it showed that 83% of entrepreneurs do not access traditional forms of capital at the time of startup. So that's either debt or venture. Wow. And the reasons are multiple. But that really affects those from underrepresented populations or economically disadvantaged populations. So the debt, you can't get debt because, like with my dad, it was like, well, great, okay, I get it, but your credit score is 7.2. Or you've got good credit, but just not enough credit experience. Then venture capital, going to maybe 4 geographic locations, the majority of it, over 70% going to 4 geographic locations, at least around only 2% of that going to women or just above women-owned firms, and 1% to African Americans, and so on and so forth. That's a problem. So the macro trends pretty much have stayed entrenched. We haven't seen those change. And so the systems and gears of finance continue to be a problem for BIPOC, women, and rural entrepreneurs. And yet we can point to some things that get more people to pay attention. So let me give you a story of what we're doing here in Kansas City. So there's a community development financial institution called AltCap. And I'll get into this, and this will give some ideas of how we're thinking through capital access and how folks can be thinking through it as well. So AltCap, ALT, capital CAP, is a community development finance. It invests in underestimated communities throughout Kansas City Metro. And they deploy capital through innovative financing projects and targeting small businesses and economic development programming, and a number of different things. And so back in 2016, they made more than 9 million microloans to disadvantaged businesses, including those Black people, other people of color, women, with an average loan size of $27,000. So what we did, we in 2020, we established a catalytic investment to them through it's called the Kansas City COVID-19 Relief and Recovery Fund, where our initial $500,000, which turned into $800,000, catalyzed them raising up to about close to $5 million throughout the city. And they made more than 150 loans in 8 months.
Wow. During
COVID with 0% default. That proves out what I'm talking about, that this paradigm that people are uninvestable, this paradigm that if you don't look like a certain entrepreneur, you don't live in the right zip code or whatever, you're too much of a risk. It blows that out of the water. And that's what we wanted to test out and try out to see. And like one entrepreneur here in KC that benefited, you can look him up. His name is Chris Evans, and he owns T-Shirt King here. He moved away to attend Morehouse College, build a career, went to University of Michigan, came back. He took over the family business. COVID came and then wiped it out, right? Because he's been serving sports teams and other things with his T-shirts. But because of the COVID-19 Relief and Recovery Fund and the money he got through AltCap, he was able to retain the business, retain employees, and it's just a great type of story. Someone that was seen as a risk, not as a risk, can do quite well. So one more thing, just to close on CDFIs and what we're going to be doing here in KC. So by the end of this year, another $14 million will be into capitalizing the loan funds of CDFIs to grow the lending pool, because the gap between what traditional financing can do here and alternative financing is too big. So we're putting in more money to the loan pool to get to entrepreneurs. The loans that'll be made will include innovative financing models like revenue-based financing or other different models that take the weight off the pressure of the entrepreneur at the beginning. So it goes almost into character-based types. Like, I believe you, I trust you. You don't have to repay until you begin starting to make revenues. See that reverse model of, so when those type of creative things, and I would hope to see those models get much more adopted into what other folks are doing, even in traditional lending. That's a lot of information, so I'm going to stop right there and take a question. But
yeah, no, thank you for talking about models that work. I think that is a fundamental issue, is that, there are some people who have good intentions, but does the model work? Does it support the long-term sustainability of the entrepreneur and their business?
Right.
You all are really intentionally thinking about those models. And for those who are listening along, encourage you to look into community development financial.
And I've got another one too, but that might be in another question we'll get to. So I have another example of model, so I'm happy to share.
I don't want to mess up the flow. This is a great conversation, so feel free to go ahead and share it.
Okay. So, but it can't all be about debt, right? So that's why we're continuing our work through our Capital Access Lab. Now, what is a Capital Access Lab? So I mentioned that report in 2019. It came out and said 83% of entrepreneurs do not access traditional funding at the time of startup. We said, okay, system broken. How do we as philanthropy play more actively to test out a new system? If the system's broken, go try it. And that's why we come to our work to be very active, very somewhat uncommon foundation. We run a lot of programs and we just get out there in the street, you know what I mean? And so what the Capital Access pilot was to prove out that entrepreneurs like my father are indeed investable and not a risk. So it's a national pilot initiative that aims to promote and test and scale these innovative models, financing. So these models of financing done by investment managers to provide a new kind of capital to as many entrepreneurs as possible. So we took $3 million that we grant that because we can't grant directly to for-profit. So grant, and we put it into a donor advised fund, which has been invested in 6 funds, like Melissa Bradley's 1863 in Washington, D.C., and Jewel Burke Solomon, and Collab Capital down in Atlanta, Capacity Capital down in Chattanooga, Tennessee, that's testing out a rural model, all from different demographics and different specialties. Of that $3 million that we put in to this test, it's catalyzed over $177 million of other investments that's been raised by the funds.
Wow.
And to date, more than 25 million of that is going to fund entrepreneurs across 40 companies. That's philanthropy testing that. If we can test that and show that it's working, who else can do the same thing? Ideally, I'd love to see traditional financial institutions. So imagine if my dad could have gone to the bank and said, I'm sorry, Mr. Gaskin, you strike out again here. However, here's another option for you. It's called revenue-based financing, and That's what I want to get to. That's what we want. We all want to get to, right? So that at that point of transaction, it goes from a no to a yes, from a disgust to a delight, to an opportunity, to all of that. So fundamentally changing how capital is distributed and lended is one of the things. And so the demographics on this model are really neat too. So 86% of the founders are Black or other people of color, 61% female founders. In 75% of the cities are outside of the major capital hubs. That's the reverse of the venture capital model, where over 75% is in those hubs. And so it just underscores the inequity, underscores what can be done if we all, those institutions that have the resources can put our minds to it and try on things differently. So.
And the results speak for itself, right? And the level of impact there. Would love to dive in a little bit more about Capital Access Lab. What a powerful program that you all have launched here to address some of the lack of investor diversity and in the results there. Would also like to hear, when you talk about investing in non-traditional areas, what were some of the approaches that you were in investing in non-traditional entrepreneurs, right? Those people of color and women entrepreneurs. What were you saying to these investors? Like, can you give us a high-level summary of what you shared to really encourage them and get them to kind of look at these things differently?
It's an asset framing. It's telling more stories of success, telling stories of asset. But I also say, and I'd say this in some of the speeches that I give, I talk about that last great untapped asset class is hiding in plain sight. They had to see they had to see the money in it. Let's just be honest. They had to see that it's just less risky, and there's a whole new market out here for you that you can invest in. And there's a stat that I use. It's $69.1 trillion in global assets across the 4 major asset classes. Less than 1.7% is invested in people of color or women out of $69.1 trillion. Talking in that language sometimes, I think that penetrated also to investors to just realize the gap, because sometimes they're in the game and they think they're doing the right thing, not necessarily trying to do anything wrong. People are like, oh, really? Wow. It's that big of a gap. And so who's going to buy your products in 20 years when less than half the United States is white? Who's going to pass on your business? If you're going to pass on your very proud investing business or whatever you might have to your children, who's going to buy the products? So this is about not only viability, sustainability of the United States economy, but in the business and the things that you like and love. So really, it's when you think about it, it's a quite patriotic message, frankly. And I think that that language and just building trust. So here it's in Kansas City. When we started that COVID-19 relief and recovery fund, I remember we had banks in the room, or virtual Zoom rooms, and they weren't getting it. But we worked with the Chamber of Commerce. We started worked with their task force, and we just worked with the banks, investors over 2 years. Not all of them are in, but now they're like, okay, we want in. Now we want to do some of these things differently. And, so it's relationships, it's language, it's framing, it's a number of different things.
Great perspective on how you frame that, and completely agree. We talk about this thing like the narratives, right? What is the narrative of success, and what does that look like?
Yeah.
And love hearing about what you just shared about partnerships as well, and who's at the table and how they are being intentional and making sure that investments are equitable. And yeah, of course, everyone is like, show me the money. There are viable business cases to show that these businesses are addressing untapped needs and showing how that relates. So I love how you push that. I'd like to kind of follow up with that question on thinking about those players and those partnerships and those relationships. Who do you view as the most important players at the table right now to make capital access equitable? Is it government, the private sector, and how are you all approaching those players with your work?
It's a team sport. I don't say it's any one. I would say that policymakers now are in a wonderful position, an advantageous position, I believe. And I think part of it is because the understanding of entrepreneurship is growing, and the word entrepreneurship, as opposed to small business or Main Street, I think more getting entrepreneurship means, wow, right here in my community, people with great ideas starting jobs and changing the economy. So I did it with policymakers, which is why our America's New Business Plan, which is our 4-point policy plan that we came out with a couple of years ago, is really taking off. And it has, the pillars to it are about have knowledge, opportunity, knowledge, funding, and support, with some practical examples for policymakers at the local, state, and federal level to try on and to enact things that they can do to change conditions. But it's corporate, it's government, it's nonprofit, it's NGO, it's everyone. It's certainly a team sport. But I'm pleased at the energy, especially that mayors have right now. But I just don't want to single out mayors and diss others. I'm not saying that. But I'll start with policymakers, who, by the way, we encourage to listen and hear more stories from the entrepreneurs in your congressional districts, in your communities. It's something that we had to halt because of COVID. But once a year, we would take entrepreneurs to Capitol Hill. We call it Hill Day, so that they can talk to their state representatives or local representatives in Washington while they're in Washington. and just talk about the everyday stories and strife that they may be going through as an entrepreneur trying to start that business on Main Street or Crenshaw Boulevard or where Shelton Avenue in Philly, wherever it may be, right? And so I think that policymakers, I'm really excited about that space.
Yes, love to hear that, and thank you for also mentioning America's New Business Plan and opportunities for policymakers. We'd love to hear a little bit more about you all's role with America's New Business Plan and how you see it impacting capital access for entrepreneurs of color in the future.
Yeah, well, how we came up with it, we just realized that there was not one, we didn't think there was one singular advocacy paper or a way to more singularly tie and cohese this conversation around entrepreneurship and advocate for the entrepreneur. What's that thing? And so that's how it came about. And we had some consultants work with us, and there was, we worked with the House and Senate Small Business and Entrepreneurship caucuses to hear from them, both sides of the aisle, coming up with ideas and what they were hearing and what would be useful for them. And then we did some polling to see what pillars and what themes resonated. And it's the 4 pillars of access to opportunity, which is, too many entrepreneurs just don't have the opportunity for it. Just remains so hard for so many people. For instance, too many entrepreneurs face that confusing gauntlet, whatever the word you want to use, of regulations and permits. Trying to start the business. So how do I file this permit? Why does it take so long? And they don't have them like big companies. No one's got a whole bunch of money for attorneys and consultants and stuff like that. And so how do we just make opportunity, the way to start, easier? The access to funding part, and you mentioned the funding part, is just realize that we've got to close that wealth gap for those who have talent to become assets for the community, closing the credit gap for entrepreneurs like my dad, alternative means of funding, alternative means of financing. I meant to say financing. How do other businesses or banks get involved to create new ways and new loan guarantees and other types of things to just make it safer for people to jump in? Because part of the problem is we don't have entrepreneurs that are jumping in because they're assuming I'm just going to get denied. I'm not even going to try. So we got to change that part too, just as much as we've got to change the risk for the banks to try new things, for them to see it as less risky. So it's opportunity funding, and then access to knowledge. What are the real learning experience? What are the mentor networks and other type of networks that are needed? And then opportunity for support, which everybody needs. And so we see that if those 4 things are tended to, there's a range of support that could happen for the entrepreneur, regardless of where they are on the cycle.
What a great framework to think about it, to think about the needs of those groups. I love what you brought up about the confidence and the trust of the entrepreneurship as well. There's a lot of research saying that we go to our friends and families because we don't trust the banks, or we don't trust some of the institutions, or we just believe we won't get these investments, which is also behind evidence. But as we're moving to the space to try to change things, like how do we make entrepreneurs feel confident, all entrepreneurs feel confident seeking out this funding as well?
Yeah. And so some things that have happened, I mean, there was some work to redirect PPP funding, to more CDFIs. That took some education and pushing from around the country. There was a focus on racial and gender equity in programs such as EDA's Build Back Better. And I guess the key thing about it, Ariel, is it's not really our plan. It's a platform where others can pick up and run faster with ideas. So we have a coalition. It's called the Start Us Up Now Coalition. You can go to startusupnow.org. And that's the coalition of entrepreneur support organizations that have signed on. And we provide training and learning forums to learn about America's New Business Plan, and then go out and advocate to your local, state, and federal representatives. And we're seeing wonderful advocacy and some bills being introduced, things getting through legislature in certain parts of the country, because we're not lobbyists and we can't lobby. But what we can do is fund a coalition to go out there and do that. So that's been helping as well.
Yes, and definitely that just feeds into this groundwork that needs to happen there. And love how you're using your political strategy background to really impact some of this foundational change that just really needs to happen, and excited to see what the coalition will do in the future. We will definitely stay tuned there. I do want to remind everyone, if you have any questions at all for Phillip, this has been an extremely rich conversation. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in, and the facilitators will make sure that I'm able to see them so we can get those asked as well. But before we jump there, I will go ahead and ask you a little bit more about the research, as we believe it is foundational. So what is your approach to research? There's so many topics, so many areas to dive into now. And what is really the focus of your research currently, or what are the most pressing issues or hypotheses that you all are trying to solve?
Yeah, so we look at what are the, how do we get decision makers to make better decisions for entrepreneurs? So it's doing research that can provide them with the knowledge. So we create the knowledge for decision makers to pull levers, do things differently, whatever, through reading the research. And so one of that is through translation. So it is looking at, and we do funding and RFPs to just source what are the biggest ideas in research out there across the country based on what the systemic problems are for entrepreneurs, and then fund those so that those can be translated and distributed out for decision makers, not only to understand the problem, but then to make the change. And the others on the data side. So our Kaufman indicators, indicators.kaufman.org, I believe, which are indicators of entrepreneurship in the US. And the latest national indicators report revealed that the rebound from the widespread economic damage of COVID-19 translated into a partial return to pre-pandemic levels, but we're still seeing an uneven and slower pace of recovery for underserved communities. I mean, that's not surprising. I had a feeling we would see that, with some hope in some areas, but not necessarily for Black and African American communities. I think entrepreneurship rates have been the highest among Latinos and lowest amongst the Black and African American communities. And so we're looking at wanting to get deeper into the numbers and understand more of the why, right? And to be able to that. So we're digging through what types of businesses, where did they create the jobs, where did they lose the jobs? One of the things that gained a lot of attention last year and excitement was in 2020, we saw the highest rate of business starts, application starts, in 25 years.
Wow.
Many of those were out of necessity. Yeah. Obviously, COVID happened, your company shut down, you had to go do and start something else, or you just felt like you didn't have anything, so you needed to do it as opposed to did you want to do it? And we need a little bit more time on that one, because it's going to be interesting to see if those businesses that were started, are they going to persevere? Are they going to last? Or people are going to just not be able to make it and just say, oh, forget this, and go back into another job. The challenge is that other job may not be there. So then what experiences and skills are you going to need to have in order to go into another industry? That's possibly going to be a big problem. We just need more time to see if that's how that's all going to play out. But we know that over 40% of African American businesses closed during COVID. We know that our communities got hit the hardest. The nation catches a cold, we catch the flu, the whole thing, right? Which ties back into our strategy of always looking at a community-based strategy that looks at And that's where our research starts, looking at what are those systemic barriers, especially in underrepresented populations.
Those numbers are staggering. And as you mentioned, there's still so much research to be done to figure out the impacts of COVID, and with the changes in the job market, we'll be interested to see how the impacts on entrepreneurship there. But thank you so much for sharing that.
Thanks. And one thing I'll say is, so we're going to go a step farther this year in the research. So two things. So we re-released, I talked about that report we did in 2019 that showed about the 83% of entrepreneurs not being able to, don't access traditional funding at the time of startup. We refreshed that last year, and you can go onto our website, or you can go to even search Capital Access Lab, Kaufman, and it takes you right to the Capital Access page, and you can download the updated report, and it talks about the innovative models and the funds that we've invested in and all that, and gives an update on the capital part. The other thing we're going to do is do more research to help us understand both entrepreneurs and those who have left the game. So we call them the leavers. Why are they leaving? And we're going to get more indicators around that and understanding around that. We are going to be doing a general population survey in entrepreneurship, which is going to get all the way down to the MSA level, 50 MSAs, and look at a whole bunch of different crosstabs to really try to figure this out, because it's the type of thing that, mayors ask this of us all the time, but can you really tell me what's really happening right here? Because sometimes the mayor can't get the full picture. So we want to get to that level to give mayor, policymakers and community developers and economic developers more information to really understand the uniqueness of their community and how to more quickly adapt and make change for people. So you can go to everyone go to Kaufman.org, and you can sign up for our newsletters to stay up to date if you like to.
Yes, everyone should. Please go and sign up. Kaufman.org, correct?
Kauffman.org. You can sign up for the alerts.
Awesome. And we did have a couple of questions that rolled in from the audience that we'd love to ask you really quickly before we wrap up today. So one, we'd love to hear, I'm interested as well. Is the Kauffman Foundation still funding HBCUs?
I wonder if Hadia is on. She's probably not on. But one of my favorite grants ever was funding hbcu.vc. Venture capital focused work on HBCU campuses. It's a wonderful effort. We have some existing funds here in the Heartland. We have 2 HBCUs here in the Heartland in Missouri that are part of a capacity building grant process that we have in helping them with their endeavors on campus. That's what we're doing right now. I have some ideas. Stay tuned in the next couple of months. You'll be hearing some things, I hope, knock on wood, about some other endeavors I'm looking at. So that's one. But I'm in conversation with a number of HBCUs and organizations right now about expanding some of our entrepreneur learning tools that can be throughout the HBCU networks and others. So more to come. I know Howard got mentioned earlier. Met with the president of Howard University last year, and so I'm on the road a lot, just talking and listening and hearing what can we do and what we can do better for HBCUs. So more to come on that.
We are excited to hear it. Thank you for sharing that. And we have one final question, which I think is a great way to close us out, and thinking about what happens next and what these entrepreneurs should think about. But someone asked, what is the base level or first steps to qualify for funding?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Well, I say that, we look at what are the biggest barriers. It's the credit, right? So it's what is that credit score, and do we have capital sitting somewhere? So the biggest hurdles are, how do we get either friends and family? How do we get either credit? And that's the biggest stumbling block. So in your communities, I would reach out to your community development financial institutions. I'd reach out to your mayor, or your mayor's office, or even your assembly person, your council person, and just say, what are the programs in our community because I think sometimes there's a communication that may not even doesn't reach all the way out, and vice versa. So I would definitely do that, because based on some communities, some programs there that may not be readily known.
Thank you so much. And no, we've gone everywhere. We've talked about the foundation and the ground root problems and challenges and strategies from, to think about from the investor perspective, entrepreneurship, policymaker, city perspective. And now we're just giving some tangible final advice to those entrepreneurs seeking funding. Would love to wrap us up today and ask any additional final advice for entrepreneurs, for investors who are thinking about making substantial changes in the funding space.
I always close with, for entrepreneurs first, believe in yourself, understand that it's lonely, understand that sometimes it feels hopeless, know that your idea is a good one. Whether it succeeds or not, it's a good one. Don't let the dogmatic thinking of I'm a failure if I don't do what it's, be free of that, free yourself up from that. The fact that you're trying it and doing it makes you unique. You've got a lot of supporters out there. What I do I say to the funders and investors is go out and find these entrepreneurs, do town halls, open up, think differently, get in the community, ask the questions, where are people that I can help? Because it is a team sport. That's what ecosystem building is about. And if we are able to get to that first and do better at that, which is the core nature of entrepreneurial communities, everyone will be better off.
Thank you. Reiterating, team sport, entrepreneurs, go for it, do it. I felt inspired. I'll have to send you a plan. And funders, seek it.
Funders, seek it. You got money to spend. Go seek it.
Well, just want to reiterate, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for, you seeked it, and thank you for funding programs like this to continue so other people can learn more, and all of the multiple programs and research that you're doing. We love that you are walking it. You're walking the talk. Thank you for all the impact that you've made. Thank you for supporting KINETIC. And we are just so appreciative of your time today. And we've really learned a lot in this very deep conversation. So just thank you.
You're welcome. And let's do it again next year. Same time next year.
Here, heard that. We have the commitment.
Yep.